high above the hills of ancient Rome, 5 gods watched over the city, each more powerful, more terrifying, and more essential than any mortal could imagine. Jupiter, the king of gods, robed in storm clouds, lightning clenched in his hand, ruling the sky and the fate of all below. Juno, majestic and stern, her gaze piercing as she guarded marriage, childbirth, and the bonds that held Rome together. Mars, armored and fierce, his eyes burning with discipline, shaping warriors and the very destiny of battle. Venus, radiant and intoxicating, weaving desire and lineage into the city's fate. And Neptune, mysterious and unyielding, riding the endless waves, reminding mortals of forces beyond control. In this story, we will uncover the hidden roles of these gods, how they shaped Rome, enforced order, and guided destiny in ways that mortals could never fully understand. We'll explore not only their power, but the lessons Rome itself learned from their presence. Before we descend into these tales, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the secrets of the gods. Jupiter, he who holds the sky in balance. Before Rome learned to rule the world, it learned to fear the sky. In the earliest days, when huts clung to hills like frightened animals, and the river still decided who lived and who vanished, the people believed that everything above them was watching. Clouds were not empty. Thunder was not noise. Lightning was not accident. The heavens were a living authority, vast and unseen, weighing every action done beneath it. They named that authority Jupiter, not because they understood him, but because naming was the first act of obedience. Jupiter was not thought of as distant. He was present in every open space, every oath sworn beneath the sun, every promise spoken where no roof intervened between human breath and divine hearing. The Romans believed the sky itself was sacred because it belonged to him, and nothing said beneath it could be taken back. At first, Jupiter was known only through signs. A sudden storm during a treaty meeting, a bolt of lightning striking a tree where a false witness stood, thunder rolling across the hills when laws were debated unjustly. These were not punishments in the human sense. They were warnings, and the Romans listened. They learned that Jupiter was the god of right order. He did not care for emotion. He did not respond to tears. What mattered to him was balance between gods and humans, rulers and laws, power and restraint. This balance had a name, Pax Diorum. As long as Rome honored the gods correctly, the gods would allow Rome to stand. Jupiter stood above them all. As Rome grew, so did his importance. When kings ruled, Jupiter watched. When kings were cast out and the Republic was born, Jupiter watched more closely. Senators swore oaths in his name, not because it was tradition, but because breaking an oath sworn to Jupiter invited disaster, not only upon the liar, but upon the state itself. He was not a private god. He was Rome's god. Atop the Capitoline Hill, his temple rose, not hidden, not secretive, but visible from everywhere that mattered. From its height, Jupiter Optimus Maximus looked down upon the city he sanctioned. Generals climbed those steps after victory, laying down captured arms and foreign crowns, acknowledging that triumph did not belong to men alone. Without Jupiter's favor, victory was meaningless. The Romans believed that Jupiter governed the sky because the sky governed everything else. Rain fed crops, storms destroyed fleets, lightning marked divine will. To control the heavens was to control fate itself, and Jupiter did not control it recklessly. He was deliberate. When Rome followed ritual precisely, when sacrifices were performed correctly, when priests read the signs accurately, when laws were upheld, Jupiter responded with stability, not joy. Seasons followed order. Enemies were delayed. Crises passed without collapse. But when Rome grew careless, Jupiter did not rage, he withdrew. This was the terror Romans feared most, not divine anger, but divine silence. When omens became unclear, when thunder no longer followed injustice, when lightning struck without meaning, the people whispered that Jupiter was displeased. And displeasure was worse than wrath, for Jupiter was the god of oaths. Every treaty, every political vow, every military promise bound Rome to him. If Rome broke faith, with allies, with citizens, with its own laws, then Jupiter was no longer obligated to maintain order. The sky would remain, but it would no longer protect. As centuries passed, Rome expanded beyond its hills, beyond Italy, beyond the imagination of its founders. Power accumulated. Confidence hardened into arrogance. Emperors began to speak as if authority flowed upward, from themselves to the gods rather than downward. Still, Jupiter waited. Storms continued. Rituals continued. The illusion of favor remained, but the balance shifted. Laws bent for convenience. Oaths became performance rather than binding truth. The Senate invoked Jupiter's name, but no longer feared it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the signs changed. Thunder came at the wrong times. Lightning struck sacred spaces repeatedly. Augurs disagreed on interpretations. The gods, it seemed, were no longer speaking clearly. This was not confusion. It was judgment. Jupiter had not abandoned Rome. He had done something far more Roman. He had released it from obligation. Without the binding force of divine order, Rome turned upon itself. Power multiplied, but meaning thinned. Authority remained, but legitimacy drained away. The sky no longer intervened because intervention was no longer required. Rome was breaking its own oaths. New gods arrived promising salvation rather than balance, forgiveness rather than duty. Jupiter did not resist them. He had never demanded worship for its own sake. He required correctness, not devotion. When the temples emptied, the sky remained unchanged. Storms still rolled across the hills. Thunder still answered lightning. The heavens did not fall when Rome did. And that was the final lesson. Jupiter was never the god who guaranteed Rome's survival. He was the god who ensured that Rome survived only as long as it deserved to. The Romans believed this deeply, that the sky does not collapse civilizations. People do. Jupiter merely keeps the scales steady until the weight becomes unbearable. Even now, when thunder echoes across open land and the sky darkens without warning, something ancient stirs in human instinct. The old Roman fear that the heavens are listening. They always were, and Jupiter still holds the balance. Juno, she who binds what must endure. The Romans believed that a city could fall long before its walls collapsed. They believed it happened quietly, inside homes, inside marriages, inside the fragile spaces where promises were made without witnesses. This was why they feared disorder in the household as much as invasion from abroad. For Rome was not built first by soldiers, but by families. And over those families stood Juno. She was not gentle. No Roman ever believed she was. Gentleness was for private gods, whispered to in desperation. Juno was public, watchful, and exacting. Her presence was felt not in thunder or fire, but in the silence that followed a vow. From the moment a Roman girl crossed the threshold into womanhood, Juno's gaze was believed to settle upon her, not as blessing alone, but as responsibility. To be a woman in Rome was to carry the weight of continuity, and Juno was the god who measured whether that weight was borne correctly. Marriage was not love, it was law. When a bride was led from her father's house, she was carried across the doorway, not as romance, but as ritual. The threshold belonged to Juno. To stumble was an omen. To hesitate was dangerous. Every gesture was watched, because Juno did not judge intention. She judged correctness. The Romans believed she stood invisibly beside the marriage bed, not to bless desire, but to witness union, for union created lineage, and lineage sustained the state. Without lawful marriage, Rome dissolved into chaos. Juno ensured it did not. Yet she was more than the guardian of marriage. She was the keeper of female order itself. As Juno Regina, she ruled beside Jupiter as queen of the gods. As Juno Lucina, she presided over childbirth, where life arrived screaming and uncertain. Women prayed to her, not for mercy, but for survival. Childbirth was her domain, because it was where Rome renewed itself. Or failed. When labor dragged on and blood soaked the floor, Juno was believed to be present, unmoved by pain, attentive only to outcome. A child born safely meant the bond between gods and city remained intact. A child lost was not cruelty, it was imbalance. Juno did not explain herself. She was also the god of state motherhood. Rome imagined itself as a great household, ruled by law, bound by duty. Just as a matron kept order within the home, Juno guarded Rome's moral structure. Disorder among women meant disorder everywhere. This belief was severe, and it was intentional. Juno punished disobedience not with spectacle, but with erosion, infertility, broken households, dishonor that clung across generations. The Romans feared her displeasure precisely because it arrived quietly and stayed. Her temples were solemn places. Women entered veiled, bearing offerings with careful steps. They prayed for lawful marriages, safe births, obedient children, not happiness. Happiness was fragile. Order endured. Even Juno's anger was disciplined. Though myths spoke of her jealousy toward Jupiter's affairs, Romans did not see this as weakness. They saw it as enforcement. Jupiter's power was absolute, but Juno ensured it did not dissolve into chaos. She defended the sanctity of marriage not through softness, but through relentless memory. She never forgot betrayal. As Rome grew, her role expanded. She became the guardian of the city itself. Juno Moneta warned Rome of danger, her name tied to memory and caution. When enemies approached, it was said her voice echoed through sacred geese, alerting the city before walls were breached. She was vigilance given form. And yet, as centuries passed, the bonds she guarded weakened. Marriage became convenience. Motherhood became burden. Ritual became habit rather than belief. The forms remained, but the fear faded. Juno noticed. The Romans believed that when women ceased to honor the order she demanded, the state itself trembled. Civil unrest, moral decay, and political instability were not separate from household disorder. They were its consequence. Juno did not strike Rome down. She simply stopped holding it together. As new beliefs arrived promising individual salvation over communal duty, Juno's temples grew quiet. The old rituals were performed, but without conviction. Veils were worn, but without reverence. Rome continued, for a time. When it finally fractured, the collapse did not begin in battlefields or palaces. It began in broken homes, abandoned duties, and vows spoken without weight. The city fell exactly as Juno had warned, slowly, lawfully, from within. The Romans never believed Juno was cruel. They believed she was necessary, for without the bonds she enforced, marriage, motherhood, lawful order, no city could survive long enough to need walls at all. Even now, in the silence after a vow is broken, something ancient lingers, the old Roman fear that some promises were never meant to be ignored. Juno still listens. And what she binds for the state itself. Mars, he who teaches men to stand. The Romans did not believe war was chaos. They believed chaos came before war, and war was what restored order. In the earliest days, when fields lay unclaimed and borders existed only as memory, men learned quickly that peace without strength was only waiting. Crops grew, families gathered, children were born, but none of it lasted unless someone was willing to defend it. This truth did not arrive gently. It arrived through blood. They named that truth Mars. He was not the god who delighted in slaughter. The Romans never imagined him laughing among corpses. That was how foreigners misunderstood him. Mars was discipline made sacred. He was the god who taught men when to raise the sword and when to lower it. From boyhood, Roman sons were taught that Mars watched them, not in moments of anger, but in moments of hesitation. Cowardice offended him more than death. Panic more than wounds. A man who fled endangered not only himself, but the balance that allowed the city to exist. Mars was also a god of fields. This was no contradiction. Romans believed that land was secured by blood before it could be tilled by hands. The same god who protected harvests presided over battles, because both required defense. Before armies marched, rituals were performed with obsessive precision. Priests examined weapons, inspected signs, and listened for movement among the sacred spears kept in Mars's temple. If they rattled without being touched, it meant the god was already awake. That was not a blessing. It was a summons. Mars demanded obedience. Soldiers did not pray to survive. They prayed to endure. Victory belonged to Rome only if discipline held. A single man breaking formation invited disaster, not because Mars punished recklessness, but because disorder itself was sacrilege. The Romans believed Mars walked among legions unseen, watching posture, listening to commands, measuring fear. A soldier who stood firm honored him. A soldier who fought for personal glory did not. This was why Mars was the father of Rome. Romulus and Remus were born of him, not because he was violent, but because Rome itself was born through conflict. The city's foundation was not peaceful. It was necessary. Blood marked its beginning so order could follow. Mars did not deny this. He sanctioned it. As Rome expanded, Mars grew stronger, not in rage, but in expectation. Each conquest increased responsibility. War was no longer survival alone. It became duty. To rule meant to protect. To protect meant to fight. The god did not bless ambition. He blessed restraint. Victories were followed by purification rituals because Mars demanded balance. Blood spilled had to be acknowledged. Without ritual, war polluted the city. This was why soldiers were cleansed before re-entering Rome. Mars governed the boundary between battlefield and home. Yet slowly something changed. Wars grew constant. Expansion became desire rather than necessity. Generals began to love conquest more than order. Discipline weakened beneath ambition. The sword was raised too easily. Mars noticed. He did not abandon Rome. He did not curse it. He allowed it to continue fighting without him. And without Mars, war lost its meaning. Battles were won, but order decayed. Armies remained strong, but loyalty fractured. Soldiers followed generals, not the state. Blood was spilled without balance. Victory no longer restored peace, it prolonged conflict. Rome became what it had once feared. The Romans believed that Mars never loved war. He loved purpose. When that purpose vanished, Mars withdrew his discipline. The legions still marched. But the god no longer walked among them. Strength remained, but cohesion failed. Civil wars followed. Rome tore itself apart with the same weapons that had built it. And only then did the truth emerge. Mars was never the god who made Rome violent. He was the god who made violence containable. Without him, war did not stop. it devoured its own city. Even now, Neptune, he who rules what cannot be held. Long before ships cut across the horizon, before harbors rose from marshes, and before the river Tiber was tamed by stone, the Romans feared the waters, not because they were unknown, but because they were uncontainable. The waves did not answer commands. The tides did not plead for mercy. And yet, they had to be crossed. The Romans called the force behind the waters Neptune. He was not imagined as cruel, nor as capricious. He was necessary. The sea, the rivers, even the tremors of the earth itself were his domain. To ignore him was to invite disaster. To challenge him was to risk annihilation. The people learned early that Neptune did not forgive mistakes lightly, because the boundaries of land and water, life and death, survival and ruin, rested in his hands. Even the smallest waves carried meaning. A sudden storm at dawn, a ship swept off course, a river swollen after a night of rain. Romans did not think of them as luck. They thought of them as judgment. And when Neptune's will was not acknowledged through offerings, sacrifices, and ritual, the consequences could extend far beyond the immediate. Fleets lost, armies stranded, trade interrupted, the city itself left vulnerable. They prayed to Neptune as one prays to a teacher whose lessons are harsh and absolute. Boys growing into men were taught to respect water, not as a playground, but as a force beyond human control. Sailors invoked his name with every departure, offering first fruits, animals, or wine to calm his favor. Priests in secret chambers interpreted tides and currents as messages. Neptune was order and chaos intertwined, a god whose moods could nurture life or sweep it away. Yet his presence was not always violence. Gentle tides brought fish and fertile soil. Rivers carried irrigation to the fields. Water, when honored, was essential to survival. Neptune's blessing was measured, conditional, absolute. Romans understood instinctively that their prosperity depended on his balance. To gain it, one must respect it. To neglect it was to court ruin. The god's power extended to war as well. Fleets sent to distant lands were not merely instruments of conquest. They were trials. A general might strategize for months, yet if Neptune's favor was absent, the ships would founder, storms would scatter men, and victory would be snatched by chance. Romans did not believe victory alone secured the god's approval. Survival and order were proof that the god's attention had been earned. Stories spoke of Neptune walking unseen across the seas, his trident raising or lowering waves, his chariot pulled by creatures no mortal had seen, guiding or punishing as required. Yet Romans rarely feared him for cruelty. They feared him for truth. Neptune revealed limits. Human ambition might extend across continents, but the seas reminded them that some forces were beyond control. No army could command the tide. No empire could tame the storm. Even earthquakes fell under his authority, because water ran beneath the earth, shaping it as inexorably as waves shape the shore. A trembling city, a sinking harbor, a river that broke its banks. These were not anomalies. They were messages, lessons, signs that Neptune had been acknowledged or ignored. And the Romans, who feared chaos most, learned to interpret each sign, because ignoring them invited catastrophe. As Rome expanded, the challenge grew. The Mediterranean, once distant, became central to trade, war, and ambition. Every campaign over water became a negotiation with Neptune himself. Sailors knew that no formation, no strategy, no loyalty alone could guarantee survival. Only respect for the god, through ritual, prayer, and humility, could align human endeavor with the tides of fate. And yet, some still tested him. Ambitious men believed they could cross without offerings, sail without rites, conquer without acknowledgement. The sea answered in silence first, then in fury. Ships vanished, storms rose without warning, currents swallowed men whole. These events were not arbitrary. They were instruction. Neptune had not punished, they had ignored. Eventually, the Romans understood the lesson. Neptune's dominion was absolute, but it was not personal. He did not delight in death or triumph. He did not favor one man over another out of whim. He was the embodiment of natural law, the guardian of the boundaries humans could never cross safely. To survive, to prosper, to sustain the city itself, one had to acknowledge what could not be controlled. Even today, the old Roman instinct lingers. Sailors pause at the horizon. Rivers are respected. Venus, she who blesses and burns. Rome always knew that some power was older than sword, older than law, older than the city itself. It lived in the hearts of men and women, in the longing that stirred when they looked to the horizon, and in the blood that tied the living to the ancestors. They called her Venus. She did not arrive with noise. She arrived in whispers, the sudden glance that made hearts race, the heat that made decisions impossible, the beauty that demanded attention. Romans believed she was the goddess of desire. But more than desire, she was the seed of their destiny. Love, attraction, fertility, these were her tools. Through her, the city itself was tied to the divine. They said that Aeneas, wandering after Troy, carried her favor in his veins. That blood linked the Trojans to Rome, and through them, the city's fate to the goddess herself. Venus was not distant. She was ancestral, the silent architect of empire. Every citizen born under her blessing carried a trace of the divine, whether they knew it or not. In private homes, mothers prayed to her for fertility, for children who would survive storms, disease, and famine. Fathers invoked her when seeking strong descendants who could carry Rome forward. She was invoked not lightly, for her favor came with expectation. The Romans did not ask for comfort or ease. They asked for lineage, prosperity, legitimacy. She was also seductive in the most dangerous way. Not merely in beauty, but in power. Those who sought her blessing too openly risked being undone. Men abandoned alliances for desire. Women carried shame for the favor of a glance. Yet this was how she worked. By weaving her influence into life, she made destiny inevitable. Rome learned that what Venus touched could prosper or could burn. Temples to Venus were rare but luminous. Festivals celebrated her carefully, with processions of young women, offerings of flowers, and dances that mimicked the natural rhythm of birth and growth. Nothing was wasted, nothing careless. Romans understood instinctively that Venus's grace was not kindness. It was authority over life, over lineage, over the legitimacy of those who claimed Rome's promise. Her influence extended to politics. Julius Caesar claimed her as ancestor, asserting his legitimacy through her divine blood. Romans accepted this because ancestry mattered more than courage. If the city's destiny rested on gods, those who carried their favor were meant to lead. Venus's blessing confirmed that the state's future was aligned with divine will. Yet she was not merely political, she was intimate. The Romans believed that love, when rightly ordered, reflected cosmic harmony. Fertility, desire, and attraction were not personal indulgences. They were part of the sacred chain linking individuals to the continuity of the state. A household without her favor risked barrenness, not just in children, but in influence, strength, and survival. But Venus's lessons were subtle, almost invisible. She did not strike like Jupiter, nor discipline like Mars, nor command like Juno. She acted through temptation, through longing, through the slow shaping of destiny. Sometimes her blessing arrived quietly, a child born strong, a marriage that endured. Sometimes it came as chaos, desire that fractured alliances, beauty that unbalanced judgment. The Romans learned over centuries that ignoring her was impossible. If Venus's power was dismissed, lineage faltered, ambition weakened, and destiny itself seemed uncertain. She reminded Rome that fertility and legitimacy were inseparable. A city without her favor might grow in size, but not in strength. Its rulers might rise, but not endure. And this is what the Romans feared most, that prosperity without Venus's blessing was hollow. Success could be gained by force, by cunning, even by cunning deception. But without the goddess weaving her favor into the blood of the city, Rome could never claim lasting legitimacy. Yet her touch was never capricious. Those who honored her, who aligned themselves with her laws of destiny and ancestry, flourished. Citizens and leaders alike could carry her favor, but only if they remembered her role: to bless, to shape, to demand obedience through the softest of powers, the desire that binds, and the blood that endures. It was only at the end, centuries later, when Rome reflected on its ancestry and the survival of its ruling families, that the truth became clear. Venus had never been a goddess of mere beauty. She had never been a goddess of casual. Rome was never built on stone alone, nor on armies, nor on law. It was built on the vigilance of powers older than memory, older than the city itself. Jupiter held the sky, watching oaths and order. Juno guarded marriage, childbirth, and the fragile bonds that sustain the state. Mars taught men to fight not for bloodlust, but for duty, discipline, and survival. Venus wove desire into destiny, binding ancestry to the legitimacy of empire. Neptune measured human ambition against the tides, reminding mortals that some forces could never be mastered. Each god shaped Rome in silence as much as in spectacle. Their presence was felt in storms, in marriages, in victories, in longing, and in the ceaseless ebb of water. The Romans understood that survival depended not on chance or strength alone, but on attentive obedience to powers beyond themselves. And yet, centuries later, the question remains, echoing through empty temples and silent hills. If the gods watched still and the city endured, was Rome ever truly protected by their favor? Or did it survive only as long as it remembered how to honor them? Would the balance hold if men forgot the weight of oaths, the duty of lineage, the discipline of war, the power of desire, and the limits of nature? Or, in their forgetting, had they already begun to rule themselves into ruin?